All right, well, hi everyone, and welcome to this lovely webinar this afternoon. And we're happy to welcome Rebekah. She's going to be telling us a little bit about how to make a good PowerPoint. So, Rebekah, I'm going to let you take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Sydney. So thanks everyone for coming today. I am going to talk about something that I talk quite a bit about, but to give you a little bit of information about who I am, my name is Rebekah, and I work here at the U of S. I work in the College of Engineering, but I usually follow it up right away by saying, but I'm not an engineer. I actually teach communication courses here in the college. So I teach technical communication and also public speaking, which is funny that I almost forgot what I taught for a second there. I think it's been a long term for all of us. I've been here since 2006, and I teach the course RCM 200, which is Effective Professional Communication. And one of my passions is to help people to get their ideas across in a way that has power and has impact. And so that's what we're going to be doing today here for the next 45 minutes or so, is we're going to be talking about how do we use tools in order to make sure our message is understood by our audience. So we have two agendas today. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about my background, and my background is from the discipline of rhetoric. And so I'm going to be giving you what I like to call a rhetorical formula for public speaking, give you just a little tiny taste of the theory, and then we're going to apply that theory right away to how to set up a compelling presentation. So I'm going to be asking you a lot of questions. I don't tend to just talk to myself. Like, I like to ask you all lots of questions. And so I'm going to be asking you for some feedback here along the way. But the first part of the talk will be just kind of giving you some theoretical foundations for things for you to think about when setting up your PowerPoint. And then we'll spend a few minutes towards the end of the presentation just brainstorming some strategies for how to deal with the nerves when it comes to this type of presentation. I'm going to stop sharing just for a second because I want to hear from you. And I asked you all before we started the recording, and if you just joined us, you can play along. What I'd like you to do is, if you haven't yet, in the chat, and don't hit enter quite yet, type out what are some characteristics of really bad PowerPoint presentations. So we've seen probably a lot of them. Think about, some really poor class presentations, maybe a really boring lecture, maybe a bad TED Talk. When you're ready, hit enter. Go ahead, hit enter and tell me what you see. And you can scroll through. We call this a chatterfall. So we can scroll through and see all the different characteristics here. Too many words. Oh, wall of text, boring content, overloaded slides. Oh, you guys, you have so many good ones here. Hey, poor infographic, another graphic materials. We'll talk about that, Caden, about why it's so important to pick the right graphic for the job. Too many words, distraction of human connection, of speaking to someone. We'll talk about that, Celeste, how important it is to relate to your audience. It doesn't matter how great your information is. If you're not able to relate to your audience, you won't get very far. Too many words, lots of writing, long paragraphs of text heavy slides. Oh, you guys are singing my praises. Thank you. Too much text. That is definitely the case, is too much text. Let's see. Too many moving things, animations. Yep. Presenters that read slide content and slides of too much content and text. All of these are great pitfalls of PowerPoint. And because PowerPoint is free, I think people misuse it a lot. And so we're going to talk about some of the reasons why people don't use PowerPoint in a way that's effective. But before we do that, let's get back to our slides and let's talk more about some of the theory behind the practice of putting together a good PowerPoint presentation. So like I mentioned to you before, I work in the College of Engineering and I teach the discipline of rhetoric. And we use this discipline of rhetoric as the foundation for what we teach in technical communication. And so looking back in time, we go all the way back to Aristotle, which I'm sure all of you at least are familiar with his name, Greek philosopher who came up with the discipline of rhetoric. I always tease my students, he literally wrote the book on rhetoric. His book was called Rhetoric. And what he did was he started thinking about what does it take to communicate? So when we communicate, oftentimes we think of communication in a linear capacity, right? So we think that there's a sender who's got a message and someone receives that message. Now that's one model of communication, but that's not the model I want you to think about. That's not the shape, anyway, I want you to think about. The shape I want you to think about is a triangle. And the reason why I want you to think about the triangle is a triangle has angles. A triangle has different types of interactions. It's not quite as simple as going from point A to point B. There's lots of things that you have to consider along the way. And so Aristotle started thinking about communication as a triangle. He called this the rhetorical triangle. And in order to think about the rhetorical triangle, he thought about the three parts that are always involved whenever any type of communication takes place. And so in order for communication to take place, we have to have someone who obviously is a sender, right? Or a speaker, someone who has a message, whether it's a spoken or written message, we got something to say, which means we have to have an audience to direct our message towards. So that's the three parts of the triangle. Now, what I want you to think about is how each of these parts influences the other, and they're all connected to each other. So notice that the speaker is connected not just to what this person is saying, but the speaker is also connected to the audience. Likewise, the message is connected to the person who's giving the message, but also the person who's hearing the message. And the audience themselves are connected to what's being said, but also to the person who's communicating to them. So right away, we've already got a lot more interactions to think about than the simple process of sender, message, received. There's a lot more elements for us to think about. And understand that each of these three parts, not only are they connected and do they influence each other, but each part of this triangle is responsible for the success of the communication. So when one part starts to get a bit shaky, then the other parts they could also have repercussions as well. So we have to think about all of the context around each of these parts of our message, not only the person who's speaking, but who you're speaking to and what it is you have to say. And it's our job as a communicator, as a speaker, to make those adjustments necessary in order for our words to have that impact. But the first step you have to have is you have to first recognize that when we communicate, there's all these interactions taking place. And it doesn't matter what the content is of your message, whether it's a personal message or a highly technical message, all three of these angles are always going to be at work. And it's your responsibility as a communicator to account for the interactions of those angles. So Aristotle comes up first with this rhetorical triangle, and he expands it just a bit. And so I'm going to give you a quick 5-minute crash course on the theory of rhetoric. And these tools I'm about to give you are going to expand our understanding of this triangle. And they're going to be rhetorical tools for you to think about when you're putting together your slides. Because a lot of what you all told me in the chat in terms of the mistakes people make when it comes to their PowerPoint slides, a lot of what you told me was a mistake having to do with one of these three parts of the triangle. So here comes Aristotle, and he expands his rhetorical triangle by giving us what he calls the modes of appeal. Now, all the word mode means is it means a tool. So these are tools, these are argument tools, these are message tools for you to use when you're setting up your PowerPoint presentation for you to consider. And so I'm going to give you a quick, like I said, a quick crash course in these three different tools, these three different parts of the message that make it work. So the very first one we have here, you're going to see that these words are the Greek words, the original Greek words, and that's how we refer to them. So the words themselves are logos, pathos or pathos, and ethos. Let's start with logos. What's interesting about logos is if you look at the actual Greek word, you can see the root of some English words. So in the chat, someone tell me, what English word do you see embedded within the word logos? And don't say log, it's not log. I always tease my students, it's not log. Logic, yes, exactly, it's logic. Exactly right. So the first part I want you to think about with your message has to do with the logical appeals, the logical approaches you're going to make when it comes to setting up your message. And to be honest, you're probably already thinking about that, right? That's usually the first thing people think about are the content, the facts, the evidence that you have to lay out for your audience. But we're going to talk about some specific tools for you to think about in terms of how to set up that logic on the page. So many of you have talked about how so many presenters set up too much. They have too much content on the page. And I would say that's a distortion of logos, because logos isn't just what you're saying, but how you say it, how you say it. So how do you set up your message? What's the evidence that you're choosing to draw from? Someone earlier in the chat said that sometimes people will pick the wrong visual. That could be an error of logos if you pick the wrong kind of chart that's really hard for your audience to get a quick grasp of. PowerPoint is a visual medium, and so you have to treat it as such. It's not meant to be Microsoft Word on a screen, okay? It's meant to be a presentation tool, a presentation device. And so you really have to think about some of the physical mechanics of how you set things up on the page, how it looks, the colors you use, the fonts you use, how much words you put on the page. But really, it's all about how you set up your argument and picking the right kind of evidence. And so a big part of your logos appeals will be thinking about not just your evidence, but also your audience, because your evidence and your audience are going to be connected. Remember that triangle, they're going to be connected. So you're going to want to think of what's the best evidence that my audience is going to want to hear from me about this presentation, which is going to require you to think about the constraints or the assignment requirements. It's going to require you to think about who you're talking to. It's going to require all sorts of different elements of the context for you to compensate for just in this one part of the message, just the logos appeals. Okay, so we'll be spending the rest of our talk today really talking about how to set up your presentation in terms of the choices you make for your slides. But the first part of the modes of appeal has to do with your logos appeals. How you, not only the content of what you say, but how you communicate that content to the audience, okay? Second appeal, pathos or pathos. So this English word is a little bit more of a challenge to see. It's P-A-T-H, and it's embedded in certain English words. So can you think of an English word that has the P-A-T-H and not path, P-A-T-H embedded in it, pathology? It's not pathology, Hillary, though I bet you if I knew enough etymology, I'd be able to make that connection. But what I was looking for was actually empathy and sympathy. Yeah, exactly. Empathy, sympathy. Think about what those two terms mean. Let's start with empathy. When we talk about someone being empathetic with us, what do we mean? Well, we mean they connect. Exactly. Thank you, Caden. They connect with us, right? So they're connecting with us in a way that we understand. And that's what pathos is. Pathos is all about audience connection. What Aristotle said was it's not enough for us to have content. We also have to have connection. And if our audience doesn't feel connected, if they don't understand the relevance, if they don't understand the significance, if they don't feel emotionally connected to what we're talking about, if they don't feel seen, then they're not going to listen to what we have to say. They feel lost. Exactly, Caden. They feel lost. They don't feel like that you're actually talking to them. So when you're setting up your slides, you have to think about your audience. You have to think about how to set up your slides in a way that's going to draw them into your message, keep them interested in your message, which really requires a lot of work on your part of really thinking about who you are and who you're speaking to. So not only do you have those logical appeals, but you also have a bit of an emotional appeal. Even for a technical presentation, you can have emotion, you can have confidence, you can have enthusiasm, you can have passion. Those nonverbal components of your presentation make all the difference. And it actually makes your audience want to pay more attention to you. So you have to have pathos. I know sometimes people think, and especially in more technical fields, it's just about the data, but think about some really bad classroom experiences you've had where the prof only talked about the data, only lectured at you and didn't ask any questions, didn't make sure that you understood. Okay, I'll get to it in a second, Caden. You know what that feels like, right? As a student, when you don't feel like your prof is actually talking to you, they're just talking and you're just there in the audience. You have to make sure your audience is connected to what you're talking about. So Caden in the chat says, could slide order affect this as well? Of course it will, right? You have to think about how my audience is processing what I have to say. And you don't want to waste your audience's time. If your audience already knows something, then you don't have to talk about it. You can go to what they already don't know and what they want to know. Sydney says connection's so much harder in a virtual setting, 100%. Like I miss you guys. Like I'm literally talking to myself. I have a little tiny camera open and I can see Celeste's face. So thank you, Celeste. I'm actually talking to you. And there's Sydney. All right, but it is so hard. Like I'm literally sitting by myself in the office, but I need to find ways to connect to you because that's my job as a speaker. Oh, and there's Deb. Thank you, Deb. You guys, I'm guilting people into turning their cameras on. I appreciate it. All right, so we've got logos, we've got pathos. The third mode of appeal is what Aristotle termed ethos. Ethos. ETH, what English word do you think of? Ethic, yes, ethics. Exactly right, right? So when we talk about the message's ethos, we're referring to the credibility of the message. Can we trust the message? Does it have an ethical quality to it? Aristotle said ethos is the measurement of someone's goodwill, good character, and good judgment. So we're able to understand the message if someone has good pathos, but we trust the message when they have solid credibility, when they have solid ethos to back their points. So do you trust the person who's communicating to you? We sense trust, right? We sense trust in the level of preparation. We sense trust in appearance. We sense trust in confidence in terms of how you deliver the material. All of these elements, we sense trust in the amount of research that's presented and how thoughtful you were in terms of how you presented this to your audience. But all of these are elements for us to consider. And all three of these, logos, pathos, and ethos, are all integral parts of the message. Just like earlier, when if I can get back to my other slide. Oops, let me go back. So the triangle, right? Remember the triangle, and then we've got the modes of the appeal. All of these are things for you to think about when it comes to your presentation. Because so many times when people comes to presenting something in PowerPoint, they only think about the logos. They only think about the content. And that's why we have overloaded slides. That's why we have disengaged speakers. That's why we have boring presentations. It's because we're valuing that evidence, but we're not valuing the connection. And if you don't connect, you're not going to be heard. And if you want to be heard, you're going to have to find a way to connect. Okay. So this is pretty much maybe simple as best, maybe Caden. It depends on the context. Now, that said, I'm going to put you to work. So in a second here, I'll go ahead and load it up. I'm going to make you watch this video. And this video is my secret weapon. I love this video so much because it's terrible. It is very terrible. But what this video will show you is this is everything of what not to do in a PowerPoint presentation. But I'm going to test you. I want you to, as you're watching this video, to jot down some ways that this speaker fails in terms of their logos appeal, their pathos appeal, or their ethos appeal. Because I would argue that this person fails on all three levels, but you need to look for them in order to make sure you cement what we just talked about. So it's only a couple minutes long, but I think you're going to enjoy it. So Sydney, I'm going to hit play, and Sydney, if it doesn't work, can you just let me know in the chat if it doesn't work?
I'll let you know if it doesn't work.
Thanks.
Quadruple checking notes as people file in, getting the computer ready, and asking everyone to take a seat. Pretending to click something on the computer to cover up the fact that I don't know what to do with myself.
Arriving just in time.
Wrapping up our conversation about a popular TV show we watched last night.
Disdain for popular TV show.
Mediocre icebreaker joke that doesn't quite land. Attempt to redeem myself by making fun of that guy.
Laughing at that guy.
Laughing because he's laughing and I like him.
Not laughing, and now checking out for the rest of the session.
Title, dramatic pause, of my presentation.
Question about how long this session will last?
Annoyed, vague response.
Exaggerated eye roll.
Poignant quote from unknown philosopher to kick off presentation in dramatic fashion. Juvenile slide transition to spice things up. Reading a long paragraph exactly as it appears on the PowerPoint slide about a shocking statistic I just learned about, followed by all kinds of vague lingo that no one will remember 2 seconds from now, capped off by 3 bullet points. So. Proudly pause to make sure everyone notices my awesome clip art choice. Out of date pop culture reference.
Correction about pop culture reference.
Defending pop culture reference by citing social networking site no one uses.
Audible sigh to make sure everyone knows this is a complete waste of my time.
Serious and somewhat over the top reminder about how important this information is. Unexpected technical difficulty. Embarrassed people can see my desktop background.
Snide remark about how Macs are better than PCs.
Desperate plea for IT guy.
Fixing the problem with an annoyed look on my face so that everyone knows how good at computers I am.
Unfunny video I'm really proud of having created myself.
Texting my friend in a way that I think is discreet.
Clearly aware of the texting. Prefacing a preface of a preface so that no one really understands the point that I'm prefacing. And now, going through a long list of facts, one by one by one. Asking if anyone has any questions. Reminding everyone there are no bad questions. Hoping if I wait long enough, someone will finally have a question. Concluding by restating the title of my presentation and dismissing everyone. Excited that someone came back for a follow-up conversation.
Grabbing pen that I accidentally left.
Aww. I love that last part. Communicate better. Shouldn't we all communicate better? All right, this is what I hear from you all is, what did you notice in this video? So this video, I like it, it's funny, but tell me some of the things that you noticed. And you use the chat, or if you want to, you can be brave enough and you can unmic if you're brave enough. I'm also happy to use the chat. Oh, thanks, Sydney. I have slides too. I will be posting my slides in the chat after this. So you guys can have access to my slides, but I didn't want to have access early on because I'm a bad teacher like that. So Hillary says, not engaging with the audience in an appropriate way, bad transitions, text heavy slides, badgering the audience. Interesting. So Hillary, Hillary, I wonder if you could unmic and maybe tell me which of those on the list would be a mode of appeal, like which pathos, ethos, or logos. Which do you think? Are you brave enough to unmic? You don't have to turn your camera on.
Of course, I'm brave enough to unmic. I would say very poor pathos for sure. He's not appealing appropriately to his audience using their emotion or their empathy or their sympathies, anything like that. Right. He's being kind of badgering and making fun of people and kind of turning them away from what he's teaching.
Right. Why do you think he did that? Maybe ask yourself that, and you don't have to answer it, Hillary. I won't put you on the spot anymore. I appreciate you being a good sport. But ask yourself that question, why did he do that, right? Think about that flush of embarrassment he had, and then he shifted it over to somewhere else, right? And when he did that, people laughed, but did they laugh with him? Probably not. Like, people have this thing where they laugh because they're nervous and they're anxious. And I think that was definitely one of the cases. And what was interesting though, is he only badgered that one guy, but by doing that, the entire audience probably thought, ooh, that's not good, right? Like, they probably thought this is not a good look. So it's interesting how the choices you make can have a much larger impact depending on how you use them in the situation. Celeste, you have anything you want to add?
Hi, thanks. I was just going to follow up with Hillary, with what Hillary said, with which I think also is pathos. Like right at the beginning, as people were coming in and just being nervous, and I really feel that we teach in many of us probably teach in giant lecture halls and classrooms like that are really set up for all the focus to be on you. Or on the speaker in front. So I think it's really something to consciously think about, how to welcome people in without. So I think even before he started, he had already made that mistake of not connecting with an audience.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a really good point, Celeste. Thanks for that. And it's a good thing for us to remember too, is like, as soon as you're scheduled to speak, you're on the spot, right? And so you want to make sure you've got all your materials ready, you're practiced, you're confident, you're ready. And I'll give you some more tools as we go through the rest of this talk. But I think Celeste is in the right way. It's very important. The tone was set from the very start of the presentation. So recognize that and do what you can to control that situation, right? And you can control that situation by understanding not just what you need to say, but how to connect and how to build your credibility, that rhetorical balance we talked about. Look at the chat here. Ryan says facing the screen, right? You know, we talked about pathos being audience connection. You know what a big part of audience connection is? Eye contact. Eye contact is audience connection. And so like when you have your best side, AKA your backside to your audience, you're not going to be able to connect with them. And you're also shifting the attention away from you and onto the slide. And we're going to talk about how the slides are your backup singer. They're not the main singer, they're your backup singer. And so you don't want to do that. You want to make sure the PowerPoint's enhancing your point and not distracting your audience away from you. Deb says no confidence in his presentation. Exactly. My favorite parts of that video is when he's going through the points and he forgets a point or there's a typo. And that's just like a big signal to the audience that you're not prepared, right? And if your audience thinks you're not prepared, that's the first reason they have to not listen to what you have to say. And you don't want to give anyone that excuse not to listen to you. Tracy says no confidence at the beginning. Kind of going to what Celeste was talking about, interacting with the presentation and not necessarily with the people he's going to be speaking to. And Sydney says inconsistent pacing. Yeah, for sure. And that could be due to the lack of practice, right? When in terms of the chunks of text and going quickly, you want to practice that presentation so it feels seamless for your audience, because that is so important. Because the way you deliver your presentation is information to help them process it. And so if it's really choppy and unprepared, that's going to be hard for your audience to follow along with you. And also you might freak yourself out too. I know when I'm not prepared, I feel it. And I definitely don't perform at the level I'm meant to perform at. And Ryan says lack of enthusiasm, forced enthusiasm, the worst, right? Forced enthusiasm. So finding those legitimate ways to connect are so important. but that really requires some thoughtfulness on your part. So Leah, I want you to hold on to that question because we'll come up to that question at the end in terms of virtual format. Oh, I guess I really talk about really quick. What I try to do for myself is I try to engage in mediums other than talking to people, because a lot of people, Hillary accepted, and I appreciate Hillary being a good sport, don't like to talk on camera, but they like to use the chat. And so I know for myself, I've tried to use the chat a bit more in terms of engaging with my audience, but and here, Caden, a lot of profs are doing those things, and I hear you there, because PowerPoint is definitely an issue for a lot of people. But in terms of slides in a virtual format, I don't, in terms of your question there, Leah, if in terms of adding more text, I would not want to add more text, because you said here, if you're reduced to a tiny screen, would you need your slides to do more for you? I would probably say no, because I think the best visual device you have in your presentation is you before your slides. So that's my initial answer, but hold on to that question because we'll have some more questions at the end of the presentation for sure. Let's get back to our slides then. All right. So the goals of your presentation then are threefold. You need to be able to use solid logos appeals. And remember, I'll send you these slides, and so don't worry about having to copy down all these slides. Your logos goal, your logical goal is to find ways to communicate your information in ways that are clear. So this is really where you lay out, this is what my project, this is what my presentation is all about. You have that clear flow to your argument. In terms of pathos, it's your job to connect to the audience. And this is where you show the audience why it matters, why your research, why your presentation matter. You make those connections for your audience. You present an argument. You're not just giving us evidence, you're giving us an argument, but you connect those points for us. And then finally, ethos, your ethical appeals, is where you establish your credibility. And this is where you really show the audience, you can trust me, you can trust my work, you can trust my presentation. So all three of these are going to be important for you to be able to handle in your presentation. And I'm hoping I'm making it a lot more complicated than when you first logged on here. Because when you first logged on here, you probably thought about the need to communicate your information clearly, but these other elements are just as important as the need to communicate your information. Because if you don't connect and your audience doesn't trust you, you're not going to be able to communicate your information very clear. Now, there are different ways that PowerPoint gets used. I have here a fake word, Slideology, which is not a real word, but all that basically means is basically using PowerPoint as a Word doc. So in terms of people using tons and tons of text on a slide, that's a Slideology. And we'll talk about why it's not a good strategy in terms of verbal qualities to have a ton of text on the slide, because it gets to be a bit of a problem for your audience. Another way PowerPoint gets used is as a teleprompter. And you may have noticed that in the video we just watched, where he pretty much was using his slides to tell him what he needed to say next, which is a way to use PowerPoint, but we saw in that presentation, it could not be a great tool, especially if you're not practiced with it. Like remember when he had that forgotten point, and we've all been there, we're like, oh, I forgot that slide was there. And you don't want to get in that situation. So ways to prevent that are to print notes. I like to print notes of my slides so that you have a good understanding of them, and also practicing with them so that you're not shocked when they come up like a teleprompter. The way that I want to talk about how PowerPoint is used is as a presentation tool. As a presentation tool is used to enhance your points, and is meant to help guide your audience into understanding your message that much better. So slides are meant to create emphasis. They're meant to put up some text on the slide or an image and draw your audience's attention, to focus their attention on what you want them to see and what you want them to consider. But you do not want to carry your entire presentation on slides, because like I said before, you yourself are a visual aid, and you are going to use yourself to communicate this message to your audience, and PowerPoint is there to assist. So I got this list of the five purposes or five principles for PowerPoint from a book called Slideology. And this book is actually written on PowerPoint. So it's a very visual looking book. It's really pretty in terms of how it's laid out. But this scholar, Nancy Duarte, talks about these are the 5 things for you to think about when it comes to designing your PowerPoint slides. Obviously, you want to tell the truth. You get to the point, picking the right tools, highlighting what's important, and keeping it simple. Another rule that Duarte talks about in her book She calls it the 3 to 5 second rule. And what that is you should be able to put your slide up, and within 3 to 5 seconds, your audience should be able to scan the slide and then ascertain the meaning and then direct their attention to the speaker. So if it takes more than 5 to 10 seconds on each of your slides, then you probably have too much on your slides. Because again, the slides are meant to enhance your presentation and not to take over your presentation. So a lot of you talked about how one of the big pitfalls of PowerPoint is having too much text on the slide. Well, let me just tell you this, and I'll tell you right now to not read this slide, but you're going to read it anyway, because you're a good visual animal and you're seeing text and you're like, okay, I'm going to read this because it's up there, I'm going to read it. And we do this all the time in slides, right? We'll put up all this text, and then what will the speaker do? The speaker will read it along with you, right? They'll read the slide with you. Who's going to finish first that race? You or the person reading it out loud? You will always finish. You will always finish first. And then you're gonna be wondering, what's taking them so long? Why aren't they finished the slide? Now, keep in mind that as you are reading the slide in your head and the person's reading it out loud, you're not able to hear the person. Most of us can't. Most of us is a verbal activity to read something, and we're hearing it in our head. And so if I'm explaining to you this slide as you're reading it, you're not actually hearing my explanation. You're reading the text. And that's not the point. That's not the point. So again, you want to make sure that you don't get into a race to read the slide, because you will always lose. And that's not what you want. That's not how we want to use these slides. Again, we want to focus the audience's attention. So we do that by using bullets. Okay, we use that by using bullets, by using visual appeal and visual design. And we use bullets as headlines. They're meant to have keywords, strong labels, key images, and you don't want to talk to the slides, right? I think Ryan pointed it out in the chat when the person's back was to the audience. When you have so much text to have to read through and unpack with your audience, you're not going to have that contact with them. So your job as a speaker is to give life and give flesh to the information you provide on your slides. So you don't have to write every single word you need to say on your slide. Even though the slides are free, the text is free, you want to be pretty strict with yourself of how much you actually put on the screen. And if you actually have to put quite a bit of text, I always encourage people to stagger it, right? Because if you, again, think about this slide, right? We saw before, this guy, right? I even put on here, stop reading the slide, but you still read it, right? So don't do that. Don't do that. You design your slides to guide your reader. That's a logos appeal. That's also thinking about your audience, pathos, that's going to increase your credibility ethos. So 3-for-1 appeal. So you have to find ways to make your slides work. One quick tip I always like to tell students is if you're actually in person or you're delivering it in a way that you don't want someone to look at the screen, if you don't have that clicker that has the blank out key that blanks out the slide, you can also just hit the letter B on your keyboard. And look, it's magic, it's black. You're not gonna be able to see it. And so if you don't want people reading ahead or looking ahead, make sure you know the keys to use and so that you can guide your reader's experience of your information. Now, someone earlier in the chat talked about the need to have the right visual. The right visual is so important. And the visual you may use for your paper, so let's say you have this visual, this chart, this table in your paper, that makes sense in a paper, right? Because in a paper, you can take the time to carefully look at the different categories and think about how this processes and how this works. But if you were to try to explain this in a PowerPoint presentation, that might take quite a bit of time in order to get the impact that this could have. Look at the bar graph, right? You're still able to show information, but when you're using it in a way that enhances it in that visual capacity, it really helps your audience to understand what you want them to see that much quicker. And then that way you can get to the point that much quicker. So sometimes it requires you to alter the way you see your presentation. It might be very different on paper versus on PowerPoint. And if it's not different, then that's a problem, right? Because if it's not different, then chances are you're just putting chunks of text on your PowerPoint slides. And trust me, nobody wants to see that. Nobody wants to sit through that, okay? Nobody wants to sit through that. I'd rather have the notes than have you just read to me from a slide. So when you're showing when you're showing data, I want you to always ask yourself, what do you want the audience to remember about the data? Do you want them to remember your beautiful table? Or do you want them to remember those results from the bar graph? Your job is to deliver data effectively and to make a good impression of your research. And to do that means you have to pick the right tool, because your job is to showcase your work. And so by considering all of these different parts of rhetoric, you're going to be able to have that much stronger of a presentation. So we're in the last bit of our presentation here, but before we do that, I'm going to just stop sharing for a second and open the floor for some quick questions about PowerPoint slides. So there's so much more I could talk about in terms of how to set things up on your screen. But in terms of what we've talked about in terms of rhetoric and some things for you to consider, any other questions? And I'll scroll through the chat to see if there's any questions before we start talking a little tiny bit about some delivery tips. I want to give you a chance to ask any questions about PowerPoint design before we move on. And I'll look at the chat here. Let's see. Any questions anyone has about composing your PowerPoint slides before we move on and talk about delivery?
I'll have a quick question then, as a student. Sometimes you're expected to create a presentation or a PowerPoint that is more similar to what the professor is used to seeing. And so when you make a really nice PowerPoint, you don't get as good a mark because it's not what they're expecting. So what do you suggest doing in those situations where you have more strict expectations for what your PowerPoint needs to be like?
That is an excellent question, Sydney. And to be honest, like, you have to consider that every time you put together a PowerPoint presentation, even after outside of university, is you'll always have to think about who's my audience and what are they going to want to see, right? And so, for example, I had a meme for the first start of my slide. Don't know if I would use that at the start of a faculty council slide, but I probably would still, but you really have to think about your audience. And so if you're a prof, or if your clients, or if your customer has certain standards of how things look and how things are presented, well, then that's part of being a good rhetorician, is recognizing that those are the expectations of your audience. That's part of your pathos appeals, is your audience is expecting it to be delivered in this way. So in that case, I would want you to follow those standards, because obviously you want to meet them where they're at. But I still think you have some flexibility, even within formatting standards, to make your message rhetorical by thinking beyond just that information, but also how to connect that information in a way. Does that kind of help answer your question, Sid? Cool, thanks. All right, let's see. Caden says, how should we put the references list, APA 7, on the bottom of the slides, or each slide at the bottom? Again, Caden, that's probably something you would have to ask your audience, right? I know oftentimes different departments and different classes will have like a references slide at the end of a presentation. But if you use things that need to have credit to a source, it's always good to source things. I always tell students it's always better to oversource something than to undersource something. Yeah, and the references on slides is definitely a very academic thing, isn't it, Sydney? All right, let's wrap things up by talking just a couple of minutes about some delivery tips. So you've put together this great slide set. You've really thought about rhetoric. You've thought about logos, pathos, and ethos. Now it's time to start practicing your slides. I'm going to give you a couple of quick tips here. The first tip I will give you, which every teacher of communication will give you, is this one: practice. You have to practice. You guys, you have to practice, and you have to practice out loud. You cannot practice in your head, because if you're like me, in your head, you're brilliant, but there's some kind of disconnect from here to here, and it always messes up. So practice out loud, practice with a timer. If you can practice in front of people, great. We've got lots of rooms on campus for you to practice with a screen, so you can actually practice with technology. But the more that you can practice, the better. But it's important when you practice, though, that you don't practice to memorize. A big part of an effective presentation is connection that we've been talking about. And you may notice that while I have notes to keep me on track, I have not memorized this presentation. I'm trying to engage with you, to draw you into my presentation by really having a structured conversation with you. And that's what I want you to think about when it comes to your presentation, is that you're having a conversation with a point, with a purpose that you've practiced. So every time you practice it just a little bit differently, right? Because if you're having a conversation with a friend, you're not going to say the exact same thing every time you have a conversation. You're going to say it a little bit differently. You're going to have a purpose. You'll get to that purpose, but you'll find a way to connect. You can have the confidence without having to memorize your presentation. And when you memorize things, most people are not able to deliver memorized speeches in a way that's engaging. They're very boring to listen to. Maybe you've had to work a telemarketer job, or maybe you've had to talk to telemarketers, but when you listen to someone give you a memorized script, not the most engaging thing. So definitely practice, but don't practice the exact same way. Practice a little bit differently each time. And that's going to give you that confidence, okay? Now, when it comes to delivery, there's two parts to it. The first part we'll talk about here is your visual delivery. And I want you to really think about, how do you look? Now, depending on your context, whether you're on Zoom or you're in person, you really want to think about, how am I visually looking? And I don't even mean appearance. I just mean in terms of how you're put together, in terms of how you hold yourself, how you conduct yourself with your body language, your gestures. How do you stand? How do you use movement? The way that you use your hands draws your audience into your message. So be aware that if you have any kind of work that could distract your audience, you'll want to find a way around that. So a big thing that students often have an issue with is when they get nervous, they get a little bit shaky, right? Hear that shake? So if you're that person, and if you are, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, our bodies do weird things when we're stressed. Find a way around that. Hold a card, maybe put your notes on the table in front of you, right? Don't call attention to your nerves, okay? We always have that instinct of apologizing to our audience, like, oh, I'm so sorry that my leg won't stop twitching. I'm really nervous. You don't have to do that, okay? Your audience is here to hear what you have to say. You don't have to apologize, and you don't have to call attention to the fact that you're nervous. As long as you are giving us your message with the best goodwill possible, you're going to do fine. You're going to do fine. Your audience is actually here to hear what you have to say. They're not here to cheer against you. They're here to hear what you have to say. And that's the number one thing I tell my students, is that when it comes to a presentation, the one thing I want you to remember is that the audience is on your side. And what I mean by that is, your audience does not want to see you fail. They don't want to see you embarrass yourself. I mean, think to yourself the times where you sat in a presentation where the person talking was terrified or scared or nervous or unprepared, and you were in the safety of the audience. How did you feel? Think about that. How did you feel watching a really bad wedding toast or a really scared presentation? I bet you probably felt scared or nervous or upset for that person, even though you were safe. And that's because there's that connection between speaker and audience. And that connection works. And if you think about that connection, your audience doesn't want you to be nervous because they don't want to be nervous. Your audience wants you to be excited and confident and engaging because they want to hear what you have to say. So if you tell yourself that, hopefully it'll help with some of your nerves, because I know public speaking can be really scary. But if you are able to present yourself in this rhetorically balanced way, your audience is on your side. So first thing to think about is how you present yourself visually to your audience, how you use your body and how you use movement to draw people into what you have to say. Another way for you to think about delivery is in terms of your vocal delivery and how you sound. Okay, so the strength of your voice and making sure you speak with confidence. You stand with confidence, you speak with confidence. So working out some of those nervous cues that we sometimes have in our communication, those speech tags, those ums and those uhs that can sometimes creep into our conversation. Part of those get away the more practice we have, the more we're in front of people. But recognizing to speak with confidence, speak with enthusiasm is important. One of my personal goals as a speech teacher is to get people to speak with confidence and not to speak in questions. And we do this as Canadians, don't we? I mean, what are Canadians known for saying at the end of our sentences? Right? Why do we do that? We ask questions, but you want to make sure when you're asking a question and you're not making a statement. So notice I didn't start my presentation by saying, so today I'm going to talk to you about rhetoric, and it's really good, and I hope you enjoy it. It's a really good conversation. That's a bit of an intonation going up, and I exaggerated it quite a bit. But you want to make sure that you have that confidence, and so your audience sees that confidence, they hear that confidence, and they transfer it over to your argument. But the only way you're going to have that confidence is if you practice. So you're going to have to practice so you feel like you're ready to give this presentation. So to wrap things up here, quick summary. Find a way to balance these three things, okay? So if you can't remember the words ethos, pathos, logos, then think of speaker, message, audience, right? Think about all the parts of those three parts of the triangle, because you have to find a way to balance them in your presentation. Involve the audience, right? Really draw them into what you have to say, but think about them before you speak, right? Think about them as you're setting up your slides, and then find a way to involve them as you give your presentation. And you're only going to be able to do that if you practice. If you practice and you have that confidence that comes with practicing. So as I wrap things up, I just want to quickly say that public speaking is a hard thing. It can be a scary thing, but it's a powerful thing. It's a way to get your voice known and your voice heard and recognized. And for all of you, I hope that you take advantage of the times you have to let your voice be known and let your voice be heard. No matter where you are in your program, where you are in your life, your voice deserves to be heard and it deserves to have that impact. And hopefully some of what I said today, you can use going forward when it comes to a school presentation, asking someone out, or asking your partner to do the dishes. You can find some way to have that rhetorical balance in order to make sure that you have that impact. Okay, so I'm happy to answer any kind of questions that you may have about public speaking, PowerPoint, or anything to do with that. Thanks, Kate. I'm glad it was helpful. I'm just going to scroll through the chat here to see, because I know some people left some stuff in the chat.
That was really great. Thanks so much. Yeah, I'll also keep an eye on the chat. So if anyone has any questions, like we've got lots of time. So
Well, Deb says my favorite color combo. That's a hard question, Deb. I like blue and orange quite a bit. Maybe it's because my inner NDP. I want to be an NDP person, maybe.
Hey, Rebecca, it's Ryan. Can I ask a question?
Hey, Ryan. Yes.
So one of the things I'm trying to incorporate into my teaching is getting students more engaged. And one of the things I've been doing is I'll be going along with the typical PowerPoint, and then there'll be a blank slide. It'll just say the heading and then 4 bullet points, but nothing, and stand there in awkward silence and say, okay, we have to fill this in.
Nice.
This is going to be on the exam, so we better make sure we do a good job of filling it in. Any sense of how to optimize that? I know that sometimes students are more used to what I would refer to as pablum, where we just walk them through and give them everything. Some students struggle with that a bit. Some are awkward. Many have often been taught that actually putting up your hand or saying something in class is not a good thing. What's your sense of how to make that work best based on your expertise?
My expertise, well, that's scary. But what I like to do, Ryan, and I know your classes are a bit larger than mine. Like my classes tend to be less than 50. But I tend to I like to involve my audience a bit more. And I find with PowerPoint slides, it's already created ahead of time. It's an artifact outside of the space. So I'm intrigued by your idea about having a PowerPoint slide to have them fill in. I often use a lot of board work because I find when I'm writing on the board or when you're writing on the slide, they're going to be writing along with you. Whereas if it's a slide that's already presented, then they think I can just tune out and I can just read this later, right? I know some profs have had like blanks that they have people fill in. I mean, I find that a little bit, that's not my style. But I mean, for me, it's just drawing them in. So like finding a way either on your tablet or on the board to get them to be engaged with the material so that they feel the need to record it along with you. So it becomes more of an event versus an artifact. That's probably be the best advice I would give, but it's hard. It's not easy.
Cool. No, thanks. My problem is that my writing is beyond terrible, and I don't think I can have the time to understand it. So I have
well,
to, if I'm going to
type it in, along a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I like that. Thanks. I appreciate it. That's great. I really appreciated all those points.
For sure. Thanks, Ryan.
Can I add on to that a little bit?
Please.
I was just going to say that I personally have always liked slides that have like blanks in them. Maybe that's just me. I like to be able to go in and fill, but also I think that the organization of your PowerPoint goes a long way with keeping your students engaged. Like if you have a subject that has lots of like key sub-bullets and then they can kind of organize that in their mind. Like I feel like that's easier to engage students than something that feels just like a run-on like speech basically. So having good organization is just as important as having like good slides.
Totally, to help you guide your thought process, right? It's not just throwing a bunch of evidence, but showing you how to put it all together, right? For sure. And you know, Ryan's a teacher, but this also works for you all in presentations as students, right? Like you have to find a way to get the audience to see the problem, to see the research the way you see it. And so you really have to put yourself in the place of your audience and think about what does the audience already know? Then you don't spend too much time there. What does the audience want to know? And what do they need to know? And that shapes your presentation, right? And so sometimes thinking outside of yourself, I know for myself, that really helps. If I think about how can I help them understand this versus how can I show off how smart I am? I don't want to show off how smart I am, but I want people to remember my message. And if that helps me to compose my message so much better versus trying to just show everyone how smart I am.
I just read my midterm evaluations, and one of the comments was how sometimes I depart from the prepared material and tell stories. It seems that some like it and some don't. I don't know what your experience with that is. I feel like some students really get engaged by it, and sometimes that's the stuff they remember, but it seems that some also want that focus and just stick to the plan. So I don't know if there's a solution there or not.
Well, it's pathos, right? It's storytelling, and we're storytelling creatures. Like, we're drawn to narrative, right? So, and you're right, Ryan, like not everyone was going to like that, but you're not going to please every single person. Your job as a speaker is to reach as many people as possible. And so maybe half your audience likes stories, maybe half the audience likes the subpoints like Sydney was talking about. So how do you find that balance, right? You can't only speak to one part of your audience. You have to meet so many different people. And so oftentimes a story or an illustration or a joke, people will remember that before they remember the fact, because that story helped them to understand the fact, right? So that pathos strategy helped them understand the logos, and they might remember that story before they remember that fact, or they will remember it better because of it. So always finding ways to make those connection points with your audience in a way that's appropriate. I would always encourage you to do that for sure. Recognizing that you're not going to please everybody, but your job is to get as close to persuasion as possible with the tools that you have available.
Do you have any advice for classes or presentations that aren't live? If you have a pre-recorded session that you're trying to teach?
That's tough. That's tough. I mean, again, it's just kind of doing that, what I call an audience analysis, of really thinking about your audience. And I struggle, to be honest, like really, like I'm so glad a couple of y'all had your cameras on, because like I really feel so self-conscious, like just speaking out into the ether. So yeah, I don't have, if anyone has any good advice, throw in the chat or on mic, but I honestly don't. Like, in this weird remote world, it can be really isolating and hard. But honestly, I think if your audience can sense you've put the effort into connecting your message, the audience is willing to forgive a bunch of stuff. Like, they're willing to overlook a lot if they can tell that you're in a good place and you want to connect to them. Okay, so Hillary in the chat says making a clear connection helps with the story. Yeah, exactly. I had my Spanish prof in university when I was in my undergrad. We knew to always ask him about Florida State football, because he would talk about that for the rest of the class period and not about the actual story. So don't be that guy. You want to be the person who uses the story to illustrate the point, kind of what Sydney's talking about here in terms of if it's disconnected, you can annoy your audience, right? You can really annoy your audience if they don't see the point. So we use pathos to increase that logos that builds the ethos, right? They're all connected. They're not just used for the sake of it. Like, if you're just connecting the audience just for the sake of connecting the audience and you don't have a purpose, that's when you start to get into the areas of pandering and things like that. And we don't want to do that.
I have a question as well, if there's no more. What are some of the most common considerations that address like accessibility? Because I think like accessibility for PowerPoints could be a whole other hour, but what are some of those first considerations that people should make?
It's a really good question, Sydney. And to be honest, like I feel like I would need to do some more research, because I only know just a little bit of my own personal experience. But I know for myself, I try to be a little judicious with how I use color, for example, because I know quite a few people have color blindness issues. I know in terms of size of text is important. So oftentimes you can test it if you have it on your laptop or your monitor, stepping away 6 feet. And if you can still see the text, that means it's large enough. So not overloading your text with too much. But yeah, accessibility, like you may have noticed with my slides, I didn't do a ton of transitions. Like in the video, they had that really cheesy transition, like that kind of slides across the page. I'm not a big fan of that, just because what happens is people get distracted by the presentation rather than enhanced by the presentation. So that might also be an accessibility issue. I know some people use, can't remember what it's called. There's some kind of Prezi, where they kind of zoom in and zoom out. That's a really hard one too for accessibility. But I think as long as you are thoughtful about it, and I would have to do some more research to find out some of the specifics, but I think it's a good thing to think about, City, for sure, as part of the audience considerations, is that accessibility and inclusivity angle of it for sure. Awesome, thanks, Michelle. That's a good resource. I'll have to check that out, Michelle, for sure. About Reed Saskatoon in the chat. Great, well, if there's no more questions, thanks everyone for coming. I appreciate all of you that came just to support me and who are here for sure. And if you ever need anything, please feel free to reach out to me in engineering. Like, I'm over in the College of Engineering.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Rebekah, for coming and sharing. This was amazing. Like I was expecting just like how to make a good slide, but you only really focused on slides for so short, but it felt so much more meaningful. So thank you so much for sharing. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to reach out to undergraduate.research and I can help direct those to questions to Rebekah as well.
For sure. And I can stick around too. If anyone's got questions too, I can stick around.
I'm gonna stop the recording, but yeah, thanks so much.
Sounds good.